It was pickets, not patience, for these paramedics in Liverpool yesterday. Now there'll be 2 further days of strike action for Unison members, walking out again on January 11th and 23rd, they announced this evening. Before then, rail workers are walking out too on Christmas Eve and various days between Christmas and New Year. Today, the government announced a huge rail intervention, but on fares, not pay. The cost of travelling on many routes will go up 5.9%, but the government says it could have been much more. How do you feel about it?
Wouldn't have as much of a problem with it if it was actually a well-oiled service and it was reliable, but it's not, it's a shambles. So.
The government say that 5.9% is actually a lot less than they could do it, so they're actually doing us all a favour.
Oh, good for them.
Do you feel like they're doing you a favour?
No.
Every year the ticket prices are going up, so...
Do you ever see your service getting better?
Not particularly, but I've not seen it get worse, to be honest.
Well, there we go.
Yeah.
There's a ray of hope.
Yeah.
Regulated rail fares in England will rise by up to 5.9%, but the normal formula for increases is 1% plus the RPI inflation rate from the previous July, which was 12.3%. So today's announcement is significantly less than what it could have been, and the increases won't happen until March. The Transport Secretary said this is the biggest ever government intervention in rail fares, keeping prices lower than they could have been, helping people during a cost of living crisis. The unions say it was still raising prices by almost 6% during a cost of living crisis. One union, ASLEF, called it crazy. What's more, they said, is that this price rise will do nothing to increase the salaries of rail workers. In short, strikes, travel chaos will continue. Chaos, which means for many, drastically different Christmases than they planned.
I've had to cancel my trip up to Holyhead for Christmas and then up to Oban, Scotland for New Year. I've just cancelled the whole lot because driving would be 1,000 miles on the clock. I'm trying to avoid polluting the atmosphere and spending £400 on my car in fuel.
What do we want? Say something! Where do we want it?
Industrial action this week meant yesterday alone there were 4,851 cancelled appointments and procedures in England. And the stresses the NHS is under are increasing. Last week, the number of hospital admissions for flu almost doubled from the week before. The numbers admitted with COVID is up over a third. NHS leaders have warned the risk to patients will only get worse unless the government reaches an agreement to prevent further strikes.
The difficult thing we've got is you cannot have an independent pay review process which takes the politics out of pay and then have politicians intervening in that process. Not only does it blow the process up and destroy the process, but it also means what happens in future years. You know, is this going to be politicians now doing it?
With the government entrenched and unions enraged, the scale of strike action looks only set to increase.
And more than 1,000 Welsh ambulance service workers have just voted to take industrial action. Their union, Unite, said they would announce strike dates early next year. Well, our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis is in Cardiff for us. Andy.
This involves the Unite members of the Welsh Ambulance Service, with 88% of those balloted voting in favour of strike action. This announcement comes after yesterday's ambulance workers' strike, which in Wales just involved members of the GMB union. That's roughly 25% of the frontline workforce. Now Unite will be calling upon their paramedics, many paramedics, technicians and call handlers to also withdraw their labour on certain dates next year. And tonight, Unite's General Secretary called upon the Welsh Labour government here. Health, of course, is devolved in Wales, to put a better pay offer on the table. But she said it was also incumbent upon the Conservative government in Westminster, who, in her words, held the ultimate responsibility for the years of destruction inflicted upon the NHS, to come to the table with the unions and address these issues urgently.
And Andy, there's also been a survey of doctors in Wales on industrial action for them.
The British Medical Association surveyed just under 1,000 hospital doctors in Wales earlier this month, asking for their views on the Welsh Government's 4.5% pay award. 63% of those surveyed said they would be prepared to take some form of industrial action, up to and including a strike.
People are beyond cross
They are just completely disillusioned, and this is so sad to witness and to be a part of. This reflects the strength of feeling in the medical profession and the alarm that we can see our NHS pretty much disintegrating.
And is this chiefly about pay?
No, this is about pay, working conditions, pension.
In response, the Welsh Government has said that it understands the strength of feeling out there and will continue to work to bring unions, employers and government together to get better outcomes for workers. But as we heard earlier, this comes at a time with health services under extraordinary pressure. And today we got the latest NHS performance figures in Wales. There were some small notable improvements, but overall the picture is really bleak. Waiting lists remain vast, and ambulance response times for the most serious calls are the joint worst on record.
Andy Davis in Cardiff, thank you very much. Kathy.
Thanks, Fatima. Well, I'm joined now by Saffron Caudry, who's Interim Chief Executive of NHS Providers, which represents NHS hospital and ambulance trusts in England. Saffron Caudry, do you have a clear picture now of the impact of yesterday's ambulance strikes and how stretched the NHS is as a result today?
Well, I think I've been talking to some trust leaders up and down the country, and I think they've told us that today has been busy, but to use their words, not horrendous, but busy in the NHS means an incredibly pressured emergency departments, not enough beds in ambulance services. That means demand is up significantly from yesterday, where we saw that dip in demand during the strike. But we're also at a place where we are now seeing the handover delays going back up. So many ambulances waiting outside of hospitals. So we're in a situation where we are seeing the pressure rising again. And I think what we're worried about is some of that hidden risk that is out there, the unseen risks. So people who haven't yet come forward for treatment, who would have ordinarily had an emergency yesterday. So that is also worrying us.
OK, and you said busy but not horrendous today, for example. When you look at all of the different pressures and coming through in some of the figures, flu hospital admissions 60 times higher in England than this time last year, the record ambulance waits, and then you've got the impact of the strikes. When you think about all of that together, how worried are you about the impact in the next few weeks on the NHS?
Incredibly worried about what is going to be a really challenging time to come. So you've listed all of the elements there. Just one of those can make it feel really pressured on the front line in a hospital or in an ambulance trust, or indeed across mental health and community services. So we are incredibly worried. And one of the things we're worried about is that the NHS can prepare for an emergency. It can put the planning in place, and it can support strike action on a one-off or perhaps twice on that basis. But if this is a continuing pattern, then that's going to take away vital resource from routine NHS frontline services.
And it does appear to be a continuing pattern, because we've got the announcement of 2 more ambulance strikes in January. The Health Secretary is still refusing to negotiate with the unions on pay. Now, I know you're not involved in those negotiations, but perhaps you could take a kind of honest brokers type of view. I mean, what do you say to the unions and the government to try and break this stalemate?
I think what we say is, certainly to the government, is that this is a dispute about pay. So it's absolutely critical that the government comes around the table to talk about pay and this year's pay deal, because that's what this dispute is about. And to the unions, I think it's for them to stand by their position, to come to the table and compromise once those talks have started.
But why do you think the government is refusing to talk about pay? I mean, it seems a nonsense, doesn't it?
I think it's absolutely critical that the government does talk about pay. I think right now we've got this focus on the pay review bodies, but in my view, that's a little bit of a red herring, because the government only needs to take on board the recommendations of the pay review bodies. They're not legally binding. So the government could come to the table and talk about pay. I think we are in a situation where we've got pay challenges across the public sector. So I imagine there's a reticence to settle in one area in case there's a knock-on effect across the board. But we have to front up the fact that this winter, is going to be incredibly challenging for hospitals, for ambulance services, for mental health services and community services which go into people's homes if we don't manage to find a speedy resolution.
Saffron Caudry, thank you very much for joining us.